Election today, people are going to be spending the day voting. I thought it might be interesting to leave Marx's later works, the more economic works, and really concentrate on some of his earlier political works. And I'm really interested in talking today about the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And in this text, Marx asks, under what conditions will a bourgeois class, will a property-owning class give up their political rights to have continued economic dominance? And this is one of the few texts where Marx really gets into the nitty-gritty of the class struggle in a particular time and place, here France in the 1840s and 1850s. It's also one of the only texts in which the cat itself becomes a historical figure. So Marx gives us the figure of what he calls the Katzenjammer, or the cat's wail, or the cat's lament. And understanding the Katzenjammer as a figure of historical possibility in Marx, as a figure of revolutionary possibility and revolutionary constriction, I think could really help us understand a little bit more about our political moment today. Today, in talking about the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, it's one of the few texts in which Marx tries to theorize what cats are doing as historical actors in capitalism. So, Marx is writing about, in this text, he's writing about a person by the name of Louis Bonaparte, who is Napoleon's nephew. That's really his only claim to fame. Nonetheless, he comes to power in France through the elections in 1848, and then he seizes state power in a coup d'etat. For Marx, the bourgeois is a revolutionary class. They're revolutionary in the sense that they bring into being the historical order with which most of us are familiar, what we would call democratic capitalism, or the rights associated with a bourgeois democratic order. Things like freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, secular education. Marx he wants to know, when will the bourgeois sacrifice those things for the sake of accumulation? And to do this, he has to really theorize, what is a bourgeois revolution? And it's here that the personages of the cat become so unique. So at the risk of appearing didactic, I do want to read one section from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in which the cat really comes into being as a kind of historical actor who punctuates the end of the bourgeois revolution. Okay, here's Marx. Bourgeois revolutions, like those of the 18th century, rush onward rapidly from success to success. Their stage effects outbid one another. Men and things seem to be set in flaming brilliance. Ecstasy is the prevailing spirit, but they are short-lived. They reach their climax speedily. Then society relapses into a long Katzenjammer. So, the Katzenjammer. What is it? Well, a Katzenjammer is, in a sense, a cat's wail, a cat's lament. Think about the sound a cat makes when he or she is crying. Think about that piercing kind of hangover. Essentially, in fact, the Katzenjammer gets used in idiomatic German to mean a kind of hangover. But Marx has other concerns. He wants to know, why did the bourgeoisie stop being a revolutionary class? Why were they willing to elect this man, the nephew of Napoleon, who Marx says is essentially a buffoon, who is out to usurp their rights? Why would they do this? And for Marx, and this is really what he means by historical materialism. For Marx, the economic will always trump the political, right? The bourgeois are willing to sacrifice themselves. He says they will nullify their own political power to preserve their right to economic exploitation. And I really do wonder if we're in a similar moment now. You know, this sort of caricature of an imperial buffoon. That is how Marx refers to the nephew of Napoleon, to Louis Bonaparte, right? And, you know, I have to say, when you get deeper and deeper into this text, you really start to see historical similarities. And we shouldn't be surprised to learn that, in fact, one of Marx's most famous lines of the Constitution of History comes from the 18th Brumaire. And that is the famous line that Hegel remarks somewhere that history repeats itself, appears twice as it were. And then Marx says he forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. So for Marx, when the first Napoleon appears on the scene to end the French Revolution, that's the tragedy. When the second, or third I should say, Napoleon appears on the scene in the figure of Louis Bonaparte, that is the farce. He's not a real imperial figure, right? But he plays the part of one. This is an essentially dramatic text. And I think that we would be remiss not to ask ourselves today, 2 years after the ascension of Donald Trump, in the midst of an election, what kind of Katzenjammer is hanging over us? What are the sort of faded dreams of the revolutionary bourgeois potential that appear as a Katzenjammer that we could say are motivating us or are with us in our political moment? And what might we do to interrupt that? It might surprise you to hear that Marx considers the bourgeois to be a revolutionary class, right? And yet he insists that there is a kind of teleology of history, that history moves in a certain direction, and that the bourgeois epic inaugurates the freedoms that we have and we know today, right? But he knows that the kind of bourgeois freedoms associated with democratic capitalism, they are constrained by a necessary tension. And this is what Marx is going to come back to again and again in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. This question of when does this tension break? When does the tension between the freedom to accumulate, the freedom to exploit, the freedom to be an imperial power, to be an imperial class, when does that freedom start to collide with the bourgeois freedoms, the freedoms of press, of assembly, of association, of education, even of suffrage, right? And, you know, we're in this moment now where I think a lot of political commentators are sort of asking, what's next for Trump, right? First of all, who is supporting him? Secondly, how did he amass this power? And this is where Marx says it doesn't need to be a genius. It doesn't even need to be somebody who is politically savvy. What Marx says about the character of Louis Bonaparte is that, in a sense, he is a historical buffoon. He plays the part of an imperial overlord. He is not necessarily himself one. That's what Marx means with his famous comment that history appears twice as it were. The first time tragedy, the second time as farce, right? I think we need to ask now, on an election day, right, what is the sort of future of American capitalist democracy? What's the role that the different classes, finance capitalists, industrial capitalists, the middle class, the grand bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie, what's the role they're going to play in supporting Trump? And remember, you know, the story of Bonaparte is that he is elected first. He then seizes power in France in 1850. He returns it to a monarchy. He then rules France for 25, 30 years in that capacity, right? The other thing about this text, the 18th Brumaire, is that Marx is he's such a joyful writer. He's such a poetic writer. And this is really a text of reading politics as a kind of theater. And I think you don't get as much of a sense of the theatricality of the capitalist class in some of his later works. I'm thinking particularly something like the Grundrisse or really any of the volumes of Capital. but certainly in the Communist Manifesto, in the class struggles in France, in the 18th Brumaire. I mean, this idea of the aesthetic and of the appearance of a capitalist world as really constituting something to be analyzed is so crucial. And the other thing that this text is known for, really, it really asks us to both ascribe an agency to ourselves as historical actors, but also to history itself. And this is what the Katzenjammer really asks us to think about. What is this historical time space in which we're all in the sort of presence of a lingering cat's wail? It's not translated in the text, which I think is so interesting, right? It's really asking us to sit with this German term Katze, and also the German term Jammer, which is to moan, to wail, to lament, right? So I would really ask you to think about this, right? To think not only about the method of historical materialism in which class struggle and people's sense to assert, right, a kind of class privilege, usually the privilege of the bourgeois to accumulate. I'd like you to think about the way in which that is sort of co-equal with or co-extensive to this historical period of Katzenjammer.